Thank you very much for the invitation. I actually find being able to speak at support groups just an additional part of the work I do, but it's stuff that I love doing. And I've worked out that at my end of life, I just want to do things that I love doing. And counselling, and more recently now training students, counselling students, I'm finding just a whole new passion kind of re-energised. So you'll soon find out that I'm more a storyteller than a big deal presenter. I've only got one joke, and I'll tell you when it's coming up so you can kind of just warm yourself up for it. But I'm more interested in hearing from people who are listening to me than hearing my own voice. I've heard my own voice. But I love engaging with people and their stories. So tonight, being called Embracing Life After Cancer, I don't know, Graham and I are still trying to work out who came up with the title, because the name of my private practice is Embrace Life. I came out of a corporate background. I was in corporate management for over 25 years, where I had an opportunity to start to manage teams up to 40 people, and worked out that whilst my knowledge of corporate and business was okay, my capacity to attract people into my office to talk to me about all their personal stuff, I didn't quite know what to do with that. I wasn't trained as a counsellor, but people were queuing up at my office door, even if they didn't work in my department, to tell me all sorts of personal stuff. As Graham said, I was with my wife, my second wife, through her journey with cancer. She died. It's actually quite opportune that we're speaking tonight, because tomorrow would have been her, and still is, her birthday. So a few of us are going out now to tomorrow night to celebrate that. But I wouldn't have taken the turns in the journey if I hadn't met her and kind of walked the walk with her as she went through treatment and diagnosis, and then finally to end of life. Because that triggered something in me that was, how do I kind of celebrate that and give back to the community? One thing about working in corporate management is that you don't do a lot of giving, you do a hell of a lot of taking, because it's all about you. There's pressure, and there's fast pace, and you're highly paid, and you don't really get a lot of chance to deal one-on-one with people. So I then went back and did postgraduate studies, what seemed like 1,000 years after I did my initial studies, and came out with a qualification in counselling in 2002, and established Embrace Life the year after. And I wanted something I wanted the practice name to represent, I guess, my wish for my clients. Counselling to me is about one word, and that's hope. It's providing my clients with a chance to see things in a different way. So I thought embracing life is also a reflection of making the most of every day that we've got. Because it's, whether you've got a cancer diagnosis or not, whether you're a young person or not, tomorrow's not guaranteed to any of us. So I thought, well, if I can create a practice that talks about celebrating what is, and seeing if we can't find a way of making the next day a tad better. Hence the name Embrace Life. So as I said, I came out of corporate management, and I felt, as Karen was going through cancer, that I was an observer. I wasn't actively involved. I couldn't find a counsellor who was... I was looking for two things from a counsellor. I wanted a male counsellor, and I wanted a male counsellor who had some exposure to supporting someone close to them with cancer. And I couldn't find it. So I felt that I missed out on a lot in terms of providing Karen with support. So as I said, I went back to study and came into counselling. I've had a small private practice. Embrace Life has never been large because it's never been my primary income source. But I have worked for large not-for-profits. I spent a couple of years out in the central west of New South Wales 10 years ago in the midst of the drought, and did a lot of work with farmers and farmers' families. And what that reminded me of was a conversation that I had at the college when I finished my studies, and they said, we encourage everyone to consider a specialty area, an area of counselling that really touches you. And I just completed some work for ABC TV, and it had shown the night before I went to college, and the academic advisor said, "You're the guy I saw on Channel 2 last night." And I said, yeah, that was me. Learning a lot about TV very quickly, 8 hours of filming, 7 minutes on the air. Edited in a way that only reality TV can duplicate nowadays, because what came out didn't seem like the way it kind of happened. But still, it wasn't offensive and it wasn't insulting, but they clearly had an agenda that they didn't share with me, and they then cut and spliced all the work. Anyway, she saw me at the college the next day and said, "Well, clearly you've got your specialty all worked out." And I said, "Really? I don't understand." And she said, "Didn't you say in the program that you were looking for a male counsellor who had some experience at supporting someone else through cancer?" "Yeah." She said, "Well, why can't you be the person that you were looking for, but be that for other people?" Oh, that was clever. Didn't see that coming. Since then, of course, I've done more than just work in the cancer community. But I do specialise in issues surrounding grief and loss. And people, in the same way that I think the community still doesn't talk particularly well around the journey to end of life, they also don't talk particularly well around grief and loss, because people think it's the same thing. People associate grieving with someone dying, and bereavement is some part of it. Like maybe 10% of my practice is bereavement. But grief and loss is associated with relationship breakdown. I've done a lot of work in corporate around retrenching staff. You know, I've sat in a boardroom with the senior people and a handful of staff, and they said, "Well, if you're sitting here with us instead of with the rest of the blokes in the other room, it means you're going to lose your job. And here's David, he's a counsellor, he's going to look after you." And the senior people just walk out and leave me with these people. Enormous amount of grief and loss around that. So I do a lot of that sort of work. And in fact, when I moved to the Central West for a couple of years, I experienced it. Of course, I didn't see it in myself, but my kids were in Sydney. I was 4.5 hours away. So I missed my friends, missed my kids, all the stuff that I now see also affecting grief and loss. Done a lot of work with young couples who are now living around Norwest, but they weren't brought up there. They were in Wallara, they were in Manly, they were in all the places that they now can't afford to buy. So this is going back a few years. So they'd moved to Norwest, up and coming, modern, lots of good things, except then they'd have their first child. The new mum says, "Well, my mum can't help me because she's over an hour's drive away. So I feel isolated, I feel alone." So there's a lot of stuff around grief and loss, and that's kind of the work that I do. So it's not just about bereavement. Yes, it's part of it. I did a lot of work around the loss of the farm, working with farmers who are like 5th generation, and the sadness around what sort of loser am I? Everyone else was able to make a living out of it, and now I'm going to have to walk off the land. Or their wife went and got some off-farm income. Never happened in our family. So it redefined the responsibilities and the roles of the husband and the wife, because she became the income earner. A lot of change in dynamics. I've done work, years and years ago, there was a study released that the year after retirement was the highest suicide rate in men, between 65 and 66, when 65 was almost a mandatory retirement age. And I was working for an organisation that provided counselling services to corporates, and one of our corporate clients was Sydney Water. Anyone here work for Sydney Water? Ever? Okay. Sydney Water was really worried about their workforce about to retire. So they asked me to write a program to help the guys prepare for not having a job. I reckon the guys' wives were asking me to write a program for that as well, because invariably the women were saying, God, he just doesn't get out of the damn kitchen. But it was really interesting, because unless you've prepared nowadays, of course, retirement is something that's much more planned, not just financially, but also how am I going to spend my days. But in those days, 65, out the door, and without any preparation for that, guys got depressed. And of course, my work in the Cancer Council has allowed me to reconnect to people who have been diagnosed with a serious illness. Now, it's cancer in the Cancer Council work, but it's all types of cancer. So what we do with Living Well After Cancer is we get together, and the Cancer Council has a schedule, timetable. I'm appearing next 2 weeks' time, I think, at Macquarie Uni, where we just send a general invite out. They look after that. I rock up. It's always in pairs. One person is the survivor, one person is the carer. So I'm there as the carer. People don't know that I'm a counsellor. I don't advertise it. I'm actually there to support the other facilitator, because most people are coming along to hear that person, not me. But because we invite partners, and I know that these support groups also encourage partners to come, because what I found is that in many cases the partners don't have a voice, or haven't had a voice, but would love to have a voice. So I've been doing that for 5 years. Sometimes the people who don't have a voice are the children. We don't encourage young children to come to Living Well After Cancer, but we have had kind of people in their late teenage years. And for younger people, we've had their parents come along. So in women's cancers, men report feeling helpless and hopeless. Men don't know what to do. They want to do something. What are men brought up to do? Fix the problem. Nothing much has changed, is it? So how do you do that? I'd go to counselling with Karen, and I'd say, just let's cut to the chase. All right, just tell me what I have to do, and I'll do it, and she'll get better. It was the early days of the internet, so I used to go online and look at all these American cancer support groups. And Karen was very patient with me. I have to, in hindsight, she was incredibly patient. I remember reading somewhere in one of the American support groups that said raspberries contain an acid that breaks down breast cancer. So, I'm off to do some shopping, darling. And I walked in the house with 4 shopping bags full of frozen raspberries. I had to go to 3 shops, so Coles at Linfield and 2 others, because I was living down the road, the other end of Fox Valley Road. And she said, what are you doing? And I said, this is it. We're having raspberry smoothies, we're having raspberries on ice cream, we're having raspberry sandwiches if we need to. This is going to make it better for you. And she was great. She just said, okay. Thank goodness you loved raspberries. But I didn't know what to do, and in all of the years of my private practice, I see this over and over and over again. Men want to help, they don't know how, they want to fix it. It's an unfixable thing for the bloke. What about the wives of prostate cancer survivors? So I think I've told the story before, but one of the Cancer Council Living Well After Cancer programs was going to run in the country, I won't mention the town, But they rang me from Cancer Council and they said, look, there's 4 carloads of prostate cancer survivors coming along. We really need a strong male facilitator because we're not quite sure what this is all about. So, okay. So caught a plane, got a car, drove to the place. And sure enough, 4 carloads, which is very rare for living well after cancer. So we had 16 people who were around prostate cancer. So either the blokes or their partners or partners and kids. And there was one lady who was a breast cancer survivor. It never happens that way. It's never happened since. But that day was magical because, as I said, I'm a storyteller. I asked people, what would you like to share anything? And one guy was sitting in second row, said, don't know what all this fuss is about, don't know why the rest of the support group are here, this is all nonsense, I've been clear for 7 years. And he beat his chest and he said, I just did what the bloody doctor told me to do and I'm okay now. Jolly good. I don't know what made me ask, but I then turned to his wife and said, and what's it been like for you? And she burst into tears. She was sobbing so hard, and I thought, this is really interesting. And her husband, lovely guy, just sat there. So when she felt a little better, I said, can you share what that was about? Like, I'm okay with you crying, but I think it'd be lovely to learn from that. And she said, no one has asked me, because you saw what he's like. He beats his chest, I just did what the doctor told me to do. And she said, how could I ever express that I was scared, that I was worried, that I wanted to cry, because he's boom, boom, boom. So then I turned to other people in the room. I said, well, to the other wives in the room, are there any other stories? And it was almost as like ducks in the shooting gallery. It's like, started crying, started crying, started crying, started crying, which brought, of course, the entire room to a standstill. So everyone kind of recovered, and I went back to this first guy, because it wasn't in judgment. Like, his story was a beautiful story, and he was strong about it, and he was a country boy, so he was right back on that tractor. But I said to him, what, if anything, have you learnt from the last 5 minutes? And he said, I had no idea about how this was impacting other people in the family. And they actually they didn't hold hands when they walked in, they held hands when they walked out. So all of a sudden that one conversation brought them closer together. He understood that there was stuff that she wanted to talk to him about. He was feeling strong. It was 7 years after treatment. And yet the conversation still hadn't happened and it needed to happen. So sometimes the wives feel stifled. They don't always have it. I'm not trying to make it a universal standard, but in many cases, women say that they feel stifled because the blokes are doing blokey things, and the women don't feel they have authority to say, I just need to tell you that I'm scared about what's going to happen, or I'm worried about you, in the face of someone going, whoa, 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 whoa. So a lot of the work I do, so what I learned from these guys, because afterwards Cancer Council provides light refreshments, and as a facilitator I love wandering around getting to know people who were in the room. So I asked the guys what was their journey like, and they said, we just sucked it up, did what we had to do, families to provide for, we just got on with it. We didn't stop, we didn't think twice about it, just did it. Onwards and upwards. Love that. So the work I do are normally in couple stuff. So I call it team counselling. Because the guys want to contribute, they don't know how. And the women want some support, even though they may not even know what that should look like. the guys, whether they're patients, survivors or partners, are rarely my counselling clients on their own. Invariably not. I've had some breast cancer survivors ring me up saying, if I gave you my husband's mobile phone number, could you give him a call because he needs counselling? He's driving me nuts. And well, no, I don't do that. Like, I want my clients to be voluntary, but I tell you what you can do. If you book in and you say to your husband, look, I'm booking in to see this new clown, don't know much about him, I wonder, could you just come along and support me? The guys are looking for something to do. They want to contribute. So we get the guys in that way. So I see them as a couple. Now my practice, by the way, isn't a physical counselling room. I do it over Skype. Because a night like tonight, if you've had chemo in the last week or two, you do not feel like going out at night to go and see a counsellor. So I have, and also have clients who are in the country. I've got clients in New Zealand, which kind of screws my Saturday morning up because it's the only time the time difference works. But I've got expats in Asia who want to speak to Aussies. So I do it all on Skype. I'm sitting, warm with a hot cup of coffee in my hand, and they're in their slippers sometimes, and not the guys so much, mainly the women. Wearing their slippers and dressing gown, and they sit together, and sometimes they'll have a family member come along and we'll have a session. So that kind of works. So for many of the men, they don't know how to help, they just want to. Also, a lot of the men don't know that their wives and sometimes daughters are coming to counselling on their own, just to talk to me. So the guys aren't included. A lot of the women don't have any other opportunity to get the emotions out, so they'll book in on their own. A lot of the men don't know. So I don't know if you've ever done or heard of the grief cycle. Again, as I said, because the study was done out of dealing with people facing end of life, people associate the grief cycle with death. And it's not at all the case, as it turns out. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did this work in 1969. She brought out her first book on death and dying, talked about death. So she came up with a 5-step model. Now the problem was that she needed to write up her research, so she wrote a book, which meant one of these stages had to be chapter 1, the next one was chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. So I've done it in the order that she published it, but she's passed away now, but I saw an interview with her that said, I never meant that. People start all over the place. People start down the bottom, then they head to the top, and then they go to the middle, then they go to the bottom again. But it's really interesting to watch clients in all sorts. So guys who have just had their job taken away, guys who are retired and haven't planned properly, men and women who have just been diagnosed with any sort of serious illness, doesn't have to be cancer. I see the same pattern over and over again. And I don't even know that Kubler-Ross realised that it had such an extensive impact on the community. I see people after their marriage breaks down. So I'll go through each of these and then we can talk about different applications of it. So denial is it's normally the first thing. It's to be honest, because you've heard the news. The doctors come back with a diagnosis, or you've just heard that there's been a serious car smash or whatever. First thing is like, I can't cope. So denying it is a nice way of helping the body kind of absorb it more slowly. Sometimes the news is delivered quite quickly. The second stage is anger, where all of a sudden you're making quite sudden reactions. Sometimes that's about guilt. Certainly with breast cancer patients, I've seen the men do a lot of blaming. I told you should have gone to the doctor earlier. Or blaming the doctor. Why haven't you cured it yet? I gave a talk at a breast care nurses conference several years ago, where they somehow, the people in the room, did not link this stuff that they'd studied to the behaviour of visitors to the ward. Because they'd say, oh, we've got these guys who come into the ward and they're kicking the trolleys and they're having a go at us, and I went, oh, so they're in anger. Oh, I never thought of that. Because by understanding it, you can almost forgive them a little bit. So a lot of guilt, a lot of blaming, it comes out as anger. Bargaining is an interesting one. Sometimes, well, in a serious illness situation, the bargaining in many cases is with God. Whatever your concept of a higher being is, like, help me get over this and I'll be really good, or I'll do this or I'll do that. In relationship breakdown, what's bargaining? The young folk, I actually did this at college this afternoon, and some of the young people giggled. In a relationship breakdown, SMS, take me back, I'll do better next time. Oh, okay. Bargaining. I actually do have a story where a friend of my parents actually was diagnosed with some cancer. I don't know what it is now. Bowel cancer. And he was really, really well off. And his deal was with the oncologist, I only want to deal with the professor. Don't want to deal with you, just the professor. And said to the professor, I want to be on any trial that becomes available, number one. Number two, I want your mobile phone number so I can contact you whenever I like. And in return, I will give you enough money to extend the ward. Wow. Doctor said yes. It's a real ethics issue, isn't it? It's a real ethics issue. Doctor said yes, so he rang the professor anytime, morning, noon, and he really did, morning, noon and night. He participated in 3 trials. He survived another 11 years. Every time the doctor said, not sure, but we got this trial, I'll take it. He lasted 11 years. It was really interesting.
His prognosis before that?
I think a year and a half. Twin-edged sword. As he was surviving, his wife was diagnosed and died of breast cancer in the time that he was surviving. Twin-edged sword. But that's what bargaining looks like. The only other bargaining story I've got, because when I studied this, bargaining was the hardest one for me to get my head around. But then I actually had a client who, so I saw the bloke, and his first marriage had broken down because he'd had an affair, and he was now living with the secretary. His wife's from the UK, had no family and not many friends in Australia. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, right? So she's on her own. He's living with the secretary. So the ex-wife rings him and says, I've got no one to care for me. I don't want to be in hospital. So if you can look after me, I will leave you something in my estate. So it's interesting. So the girlfriend said, you go back to her, you can never, right, that's it. So that's over. And he said, but I have to do this. And then his wife ultimately passed away. So he finished up with nobody, except a better feeling that he actually supported his ex-wife through it. So her bargaining was, come look after me and I'll give you some financial compensation. Kubler-Ross's fourth stage was sadness. She called it depression, but she was a doctor. That's why I was looking at some of the beyond blue information at the back of the room. You know, what's depression, what's sadness. When someone tells you bad news and you cry, to me that's normal. That's not a sign of depression. If several weeks later you still can't get out of bed for crying, in other words you're paralysed, different story. If you're unable to tell the story to anybody, you might need some help. But generally, having sadness as a result of some bit of bad news kind of makes sense to me, rather than there's something wrong with you. And she talked about the last step, which is acceptance. which doesn't mean, I always get a laugh at living well after cancer, because I'm saying it doesn't mean that you're really excited that you got a cancer diagnosis. That's kind of not what we're talking about. But acceptance is accepting reality. That's where, if you're going to make some serious decisions, I'm going to get a second opinion, I'm going to do, this, or I'm going to try a trial or not try it, whatever. This is the best place to make that decision. Up here, your brains are a bit like scrambled eggs. It's not easy to make a good decision there. So that's the Kubler-Ross 5-stage grief and loss model, and it's been around, as I said, since '69, and I use it constantly. Like, you have no idea how often I do it. If you haven't guessed by now, I guess the bottom line of my practice, and certainly my interest, even with my students, because they come with their own experiences, so my training now of future counsellors, we do look at what are your life experiences, what are you bringing into the room? And home conversations are at the bottom of so much. We were talking about it before, that a lot of people want to have conversations and don't know how to. It's a generational thing. We were saying kind of, if you're in your 50s and 60s, chances are at home you were told to be seen and not heard. So even if you wanted a conversation, and I remember Dad coming home from the factory and I just wanted to tell him what happened at school, and he'd just go, shh, I've had noise all day. So many people of our generation who wanted to speak weren't allowed to. So many of those people now, I look at my kids, I brought them up to say, tell me exactly how you're feeling. So they are actually, I've got daughters, but I mean sons are the same. It's like the new generation are almost overly conversational, especially when you say, I don't think you're going out on Saturday night, and they say they think they are. So it's a very robust conversation. Whereas in the old days, we just go, okay, not going out. So we've kind of created a little monster there. But it's how we transact those conversations. If I look back at what I missed out on and what I was unable to give Karen, it was the opportunity to just sit with her and talk. Talk about being sad. Talk about lost opportunities and lost dreams. Her sister had the conversation about what she wanted at her funeral. I couldn't do that. Wish I had. Certainly help clients go there. So maybe I have become the male counsellor who knows a bit about cancer, who's helping people. Well, maybe I have. But I've certainly worked with people about having those conversations. And even around treatment. Everyone's going to react to their treatment. We call it chemotherapy, but that's how many hundred drugs is chemotherapy? And everyone's going to get a different mix, and everyone's going to react to it in a different way. How do you tell people close to you about how you're travelling? Do you wait for them to say, how do you feel? Are men kind of empowered enough to start the conversation and say, I'm not having a good day today, and this is what it means? To ask for things. See, men, because we're fixers, we don't want to ask anything for us, because that means we're not doing a great job. But in fact, we're doing a great job by being able to ask. So for me, it's about the home conversations. That's also one of the benefits of doing technology-based sessions, because they're already at home. They don't have to drive home. Sometimes the kids are in the next room. Right? If you're not sure how people are processing, whether it's cancer or losing their job or whatever, ask. One of the biggest things Karen said to me is, people who used to talk to me don't come near me. It's as if cancer's contagious. And she passed away at 34, so I was pretty young. And a lot of her clients were older than her and absolutely didn't want to engage in a conversation about how she was doing. But her friends, some of them were just scared to ask. And yet asking is the guaranteed way. Don't make assumptions. Check in. I'm noticing you're a bit down today. Are things going okay? Has anything changed today? So it's not a sign of weakness to ask, it's actually a sign of real strength, and it really is about real strength. Because you saw that Kubler-Ross 5-stage model. When I started in private practice, I would deal with an individual who was going through these. But then when I had 2 people or 3 people, each of them at a different stage, now you look at the change in family dynamics. Because one person's in anger, the other person's in acceptance, third person's in denial, all at the same time. What does the family look like? Bit of a mess. One in acceptance is saying to the one in denial, come on, wake up, Charlie. And the one who's angry is just angry at everybody. Many times angry at the person in acceptance. They're saying, okay, this is what's happening to me right now. I need to do what I can about it. And the person who's in anger says, don't you just sit there. So it's that dynamics that I work with a lot of the time. And really it is a sign of strength because it's the person who starts the asking that triggers this new dynamic conversation. I used to be really brave and think that not crying when I was around Karen was the right thing to do. And then one day I just couldn't hold it in and I started crying in front of her. And she said, oh, thank goodness. She said, now I can cry. Because when you weren't crying, I thought I couldn't cry. But how about we just cry together? Oh, yeah, that'll work. So it's about starting that conversation, and it really is a sign of strength because it takes a lot of courage to have that conversation. I was talking before about having younger cancer survivors as patients. So their issue is talking to their parents. You know, if you're the daughter and you're the apple of Dad's eye, every time you see Dad starts crying because this shouldn't happen to my baby. Do you have a conversation or do you run? And one of my clients ran. Greek background. So that, you know, really close family. But she left home and she was fine, right? She'd had, her cancer was well managed and was in the early stages, everything was fine, except she still couldn't go and have a conversation with her parents 3 years later. So my work with her was about rehearsing what the conversation might look like. Are you strong enough and brave enough to be the person who picks up the telephone and says, I need a home-cooked meal, how about I come over for dinner? So we rehearsed it in the room. At that stage I had a physical office. We did some role-playing and took a couple of shots, but she went back. And part of what I prepared her for was that Dad was going to cry anyway. He just needed to let it out. It's a bit like the lady, the wife of the prostate cancer guy, who'd held it in for 7 years. I said, your dad's held it in for 3 years. So just be okay with it. It'll come. It is what it is. He needs to cry, he needs to cry. So she went home, she rang me a few months later and she went, you know, the anticipation was a lot worse than actually going through with it. Yep, Dad cried, you helped me prepare for it. I just gave him a big hug. He cried while he hugged me. And then we went and had lunch. Okay, good solution. So it's about having those conversations, bringing parents in sometimes, bringing children in. And you need to, and this is to everybody, not just the cancer support groups, but if you're starting to see yourself reacting in ways that just aren't you, then it's probably a good thing to go and seek some help. Other people will give you feedback. Sometimes it's verbal. Other people might just go like that when you get angry. I was thinking of the drive over just now. You know the old thing, if you just knock over a glass of water at the table? How do you react to that? Yeah. You see, some people just go, oh, God, I'm sloppy, and they just go clean it up. Other people go berserk. So if you see that your reaction to something is greater than the value of whatever that is, then it's time to think about, am I carrying something? Do I need to talk it through with somebody? Before it gets too bad. There you go. Because now I want to do what I did at the other support group and just see whether, I've gone for 40 minutes, so it's an opportunity now if anyone wants to kind of give me some feedback. Does that make sense to you? Where does it fit into your own experiences and your own journeys and your own families? And let's start a conversation right now, if you want to.
Interested in what you said about introducing the conversations. My observation is, and this is just how I feel, that you sort of don't want to push it down the throat of your family by having a deep and meaningful about how they're managing with prognosis, how did they react, how are they feeling about one of their parents having an unfavourable diagnosis or even an early diagnosis. It's almost like you don't want to sort of say, how are you really managing? And they might say, fine, whatever. You know, it's very hard to not to appear over interested in someone else's cancer, or not to want them to be more involved than they are. I mean, have they just processed it and life goes on and we'll let them know if it gets worse? Yeah. You see, do we dramatise? Do we not dramatise? Does that make sense? And what
have you done in the past? Have you erred on the side of caution and kind of backed off a bit? Or
Well,
have you stepped in?
I assume that they will talk about it if they're feeling a little bit unsure, or if not, they'll just carry on. I mean, this is a joint thing. Do you want to say anything or not bother? No, that's okay.
There isn't a right or wrong.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the beauty of it, I guess. And I'm not standing here as some PhD world-travelled expert on this stuff. What I do is I pay close attention to my clients and look for patterns in their behaviour and in their conversation and their vocabulary. My sense is that you've got to be, in a way, a little bit picky and choosy. Maybe start on the more conservative side. But some interaction, because you don't know what it's going to unleash. So you're right, you don't want to be down their throat. And you may want to think of words that work for you, that show you're concerned, but aren't schmaltzy. You know, like, how are you really doing? Because we see that a lot on TV too. And the trouble is that, you know, how do you feel about that quote, which was great for counsellors years ago. It was being flogged to death in Hollywood. So, of course, we try really hard not to say, how do you feel about that? But I think it's about showing some interest. If they then say, everything's cool, that's okay. But sometimes they might say, do you really want to know? Yeah. Well, things da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Or sometimes, remember the slide that said, others will give you feedback. Sometimes the conversation might be, I've noticed that things have changed in the last week or two. Is there something behind that? So the nurturing is from you asking. That gives people an opportunity. If they don't, take it up. But I know that I've seen, and I've listened to people say, does anyone really care because everyone's taking a step this way? So personally, I take a gentle step forward, especially if it's around an observation that things have changed, or it's a critical time. You know, I remember that you had a doctor's appointment sometime this week. Was that right? So how did that go? And if they say, look, oh, it was great, don't have to talk about it, then that's that. But it's about the invitation, I think. Many times it's the invitation.
Hi, how are you? My wife, she's in the sand. She's diagnosed with possible lung cancer. They found a little thing in her head yesterday. They were told today, and we're surprised how well we've taken it. We haven't had a definitive answer yet, but yeah, she's got good spirits, and I think I have too. And we talk about it to our son without any hassle. He's in the military. That might have some bearing on it, I don't know. But and she has a few friends around her that she's talked to about it, especially one of her girlfriends that she went to high school with, and one thing and another. And yeah, just talk about it. Yeah.
So you said you were both surprised by your reactions.
Yeah, because you don't know how you're going to meet something when you meet it. Like when you're told something like this. See, we didn't expect cancer at all. We're not sure that it is cancer really yet, but it could be. The threat's hanging over us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I caught her, I don't think that's the right way of saying it, but I'll say it, caught her crying the other day, and I just said to her, "You all right?" And she said, "Oh, I'm just sick of people putting needles in my arm."
Oh, right.
But, that was it, and it wasn't sort of the diagnosis or anything, it was just, yeah.
You raised two really interesting points. One is I hear very often that the waiting is the worst part. It's like, I've had a biopsy, or I've had a this, or I've had a that, and I've now got to wait a week. I like the thing, it's hanging over you. And that's exactly what other people have reported. This sense of no man's land.
Yeah.
I can't take action. I can't talk about some regime of treatment because it may not be, but it's so that kind of being in the transit lounge at the airport. So that's one part of it. The other thing is around tears, because crying is still not that socially acceptable. Sometimes it's another way of asking, "Are you okay?" Because that's, in counselling terms, that's called a closed question. Because the answers are yes or no, basically.
Yeah, I get your point.
Also, as a counsellor, I don't make assumptions. When I have a client who's in tears in front of me, it's not for me to say whether they're tears of sadness or happiness or frustration or anger or who knows. So when I see the tears, I will always ask the question, what are those tears about? You get, in your case, exactly the same answer, but you might get a different answer.
Mm-hmm. That gives them a licence to open up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because as I said, so some people, the waiting drives them nuts. The frustration of waiting. So I've seen people in tears purely out of frustration, not even out of sadness yet, because they don't know. But it's driving them nuts. So I would kind of use a very open, very gentle, very open question around that. Sometimes we just draw conclusions. Oh, if you're crying, it must be you're sad. But I've seen people crying because they're just pulling their hair out, which is just frustration. Very different. If there's nothing else, I'm happy to just say thank you for coming out, as Graham said, on a night that we would probably like to be at home all cuddled up. But you've come out, you've shown support to one another, which is what a support group's all about. And I hope that I've added some value somewhere in an understanding of things that sometimes don't have meaning. So I thank you.
Yeah, my duty to say a vote of thanks to you, David. Thanks so much for coming out, and we've enjoyed your presentations. So thanks again, and we wish you well. And I'll ask everyone to carry my vote of thanks with acclamation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.